Okay, this is Will Tchakirides interviewing Jim Davis for the HBCU Radio Preservation Project. It is 3:16 p.m. on Wednesday, July 10th, 2024. This interview is being recorded at WNCU Studios in Durham, North Carolina. All right. Jim, I may call you Jim for this interview?
Sure, that's fine.
But I do want you to first state your full name, and then let me know what your relationship is to this station, WNCU.
Okay. My full name is James Wilkinson Davis, and my relationship with the radio station is that I am a contract engineer, and I am also a volunteer disc jockey and presenter on weekends.
That's great. Okay, let's start from the beginning a little bit. I want to know about when and where you were born, and then I also want you to tell me a bit about the people who raised you.
Okay. I was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota in November of 1948. My father was an engineer involved with fire protection and the Insurance Company of North America, and my mother, who had a master's degree in education, was basically a homemaker. I was raised in the Philadelphia area. I guess my major influences were my teachers and an individual by the name of Dr. Lanker, who was was hired by my parents to just interact with me and get me interested and support my existing interest in science.
And where in Philadelphia did your family live?
Out on the main line in a community called Rosemont in Radnor Township.
Okay, and if I were to be just dropped into that place at the time when you were growing up, what would I see? What would people be like? What is the place? What is the sense of place?
It was basically a white middle to upper middle class neighborhood. We mostly some Italian, some African American. There's a community as part of that called Garrett Hill, where it was somewhat more working class, but we all went to school together in the public schools.
What schools did you attend?
As an elementary school student, I went to Rosemont Elementary. I spent a year and a couple of days at the junior high school in Wayne, and then I transferred to Haverford, which is a public, private school. I was at Haverford for a year, and then from there I went to the Loomis School in Windsor, Connecticut, where I was there for 4 years, and that was where I had my high school years. It was a boys' boarding school.
Loomis Chafee.
Yeah. At that point, it was Loomis. Chafee was on a separate campus, and the only interaction we had with them, for the most part, was in our senior year. We had one class together.
Was that the girls' school?
Yeah, Chafee was the girls' school. They were both established pretty much at the same time by the Loomis family, who, in terms of the charter of the school, it was for boys and girls, and it was also chartered without regard to race. It was a very progressive approach, and the Loomis family found themselves with no children and no heirs, so their considerable fortune went to the establishment of the Loomis Institute and the Loomis and Chafee schools.
And it was a racially diverse student body?
Not at that time. I remember we did have, I think, one African American student who came in my either junior year. The other student that I recall was an Indian student, was actually a Pakistani student who was there. It had a quite sizable Jewish contingent, and that was about as much as I wasn't really that focused on that aspect.
What did you focus on studying at Loomis?
Well, it was a general curriculum. I had history, I had English, I had math. My senior year, I took calculus. I went through the sciences of biology, chemistry, and physics. And my senior year, it was a matter of a senior project of choosing, and I frankly don't really remember exactly what we did. We were working under the physics professor at the time there, and we did all sorts of stuff, measuring radioactivity and learning about distributions and statistics for analyzing scientific data and a lot of electronics, because that was what I was primarily interested in.
What was different about Connecticut versus Philadelphia, Windsor versus Philadelphia? What did you notice?
I really can't say, because I only went into Windsor on rare occasions to get away from the cafeteria food. I did go into Hartford fairly frequently, because that was where the more interesting stuff was. Stores with, there was a store that it was an interesting store because it had a recording booth, and the guy who ran it would record people and cut acetates of what they had recorded, and it was kind of like what happened back in the 40s and 50s, and he had all sorts of oddball electronic equipment that if I couldn't afford it, it was neat to look at. And I spent time there and spent shopping at various hi-fi shops, and also a good bit of shopping adding to my fairly considerable, even at the time, record collection. I also was involved in the science programs. One of the things that they had at Loomis was positions as lab assistants, and these were students who would help set up experiments and so on, and so I did that the whole 4 years that I was there.
And would you go back home to Philadelphia in the summers?
Yeah.
Did you have siblings? Do you have siblings?
I have one sister who's 6 years older than myself.
And was your family religious in any way? Any spiritual connection?
Not particularly. We were Presbyterian by default, but that was about it.
Did your family identify as working class or as professionals?
More professional.
Okay, so you were interested in electronics.
I was interested in all sciences.
All sciences.
Started out with chemistry, and because chemistry was a little bit more accessible, but I quickly moved to electronics when I became a teenager, because I realized that it was going to be rather difficult to get a summer job in chemistry, but I got involved and interested in radio and discovered that was something that you could get a job.
I was going to say, did you identify as kind of a tinkerer? Or?
Oh yes,
mm-hmm.
Definitely. And it started out with interest in amateur radio, and I got an amateur radio license in '61, and then moved on. And
what does that mean to get that license?
Well, you have to be able to send and receive Morse code at 5 words per minute, and know some basic electronics and rules and regulations, and that was at one level, and then at another level, you needed to know a little bit more electronics and operating procedures, and the higher up you went in the rankings of the different aspects of amateur radio, you got more privileges in terms of what you could, what bands you could use and frequencies you could transmit on.
And I imagine you also like to listen to the radio. What kinds of radio did you enjoy listening to at that age?
Top 40.
Tell me some of the top 40 artists that stick out when you say that.
Okay. The earliest ones that I remember were basically pop artists. Guy Mitchell, for instance, particularly. Eddie Fisher, Perry Como. But then about 1955-56, Stranded in the Jungle by the Cadets, The Wayward Wind by Gogi Grant, Maybelline by Chuck Berry, some Bo Diddley. And it was always a case of that I tended to gravitate more towards, you know, African American artists. Because when I went to Loomis, I took a record player and some records, and they were almost in a Motown and Freddie Scott and stuff like that. And, you know, people were getting into the Beatles, but they were okay, but I was really more into Motown and that music. And that's persisted to this day.
And was radio on in the house for your parents at all?
Not that I recall. My folks, the music that I remember them listening to was primarily music from the 30s and 40s. Because they were, my parents were both born in 1914. So by the time I came along in 1948, they were in their late 30s, and my father served in World War II, and then came back, and White Cliffs of Dover, and Barney Google with his googly eyes, LPs of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me.
Standards.
Yeah, standards.
Did your father talk about his time in the war at all?
No. Which is fairly typical.
Yeah. Okay.
I did know he was stationed in the South Pacific and was in, I think it was in the Signal Corps. Did not really see any action.
So did you know at this young age in high school that radio might be something you're interested in, or were you thinking electronics, science?
Well, I definitely became interested in radio at an early age. I remember, one of the things I remember was I would guess this was probably in the middle 50s, and if I put a year on it, it would probably be 1954. We were vacationing in New Hampshire, and we stopped by a diner, and there was a guy at the counter broadcasting basically his morning show from the counter over a radio station. And I was fascinated.
Yeah. What possibilities did that show you?
Well, in fact, he let me do the station ID.
The first time you ever did that?
Yep. First time I was ever on the radio.
And what year was that about?
6.
You were young.
Yeah.
Very cool. So tell me about what you were thinking when you were graduating from Loomis and the process of applying to college and where you ended up going.
Well, you have to remember that when I graduated from Loomis, I had already worked in professional broadcasting the summers of 1965 and 66, and was lined up to work in professional radio in 1967.
And where did you do that?
Well, this was in Philadelphia. My first radio job actually was in Windsor, Connecticut, at a small AM station where my task was to take the once every half hour meter readings, because I had a first class radio telephone license, and at that time directional AM stations were required to have someone with a first class radio telephone license on duty when the station was on the air. So they were looking around, well, where can we find anybody? And I showed up, and they said, okay, you're 3 p.m. to sign off. So I did that for a couple of weeks, and and then that was in 65, because I got my license in 65, and the summer of 65 I started to work at WHAT in Philadelphia.
What format was WHAT?
Well, the AM was basically soul, African American targeted. The FM was jazz.
And how did working at that station shape both your musical interests, but also your professional path, thinking about radio as more of a career?
Well, first of all, it gave me work experience in terms of, 85% of it showing up on time and doing what you're told to do. The fellow that I worked for was a contract engineer for the station, and I actually worked for him at WHAT. And I was 16, and he was 24.
But he probably felt so much older and mature
Well,
at that point.
it certainly seemed to me, but the fact of the matter was that we were both pretty young. And having a good deal of responsibility for the operation of these two radio stations. So, I took it very seriously. And, worked very hard with him. He, in addition to WHAT, he took care of two stations in Wilmington, Delaware, and a station in Hamilton, New Jersey. And we would go out to those stations and work, particularly down in Wilmington. It was not unusual that we'd go down there to work after the station gone off the air, changing tubes in the transmitter, doing testing. At that point, one of the things that was, something you had to do was maintenance on cart machines. Now, you're familiar with a cart machine.
Cartridge.
Yeah, and they required a fair amount of maintenance. We'd, break the motors down and lubricate them and clean the tape heads and align the tape heads, and we did quite a bit of maintenance work, he and I.
So you learned at a very early age what it is that an audio engineer does, the maintenance work required, what a contract engineer is doing.
Right.
And did it appeal at that young age? Be like, this is like I could do this.
Well, my plan, and I got into Duke under early admission, and my plan was to go to Duke and major in electrical engineering, and I majored in electrical engineering and graduated with a bachelor's in electrical engineering. Meanwhile, I managed to keep reasonably decent grades while a number of my contemporaries were flunking out of school because they were spending way too much time at the campus radio station, where I was heavily involved the whole time that I was at Duke, and continued afterwards, and am still involved with the campus radio station at Duke.
We'll get back to that. That's an important part of your story. What did your parents think of this path you were pursuing? Did they approve of radio as this kind of
they thought that radio was fine as a as a summer job, and as something to do. They had no particular problem with that, but I don't think that they were really thinking necessarily that I would have a career in broadcast engineering, and I wasn't completely sure that I would have a career in broadcast engineering, because I finished my undergraduate degree at Duke, and I was told early in either late in my junior year or early in my sophomore year, well, you've done pretty much all the curriculum for the undergraduate degree, so you should take some graduate level courses. And having taken some graduate level courses, they said, well, you ought to go on ahead and get a master's degree. So I said, okay, and they paid me some money, and I was in 1971, when I graduated, the campus radio station had obtained an FM license. And so I was the general manager and also the engineer for the station the summer of 1971, the first summer that, the first year that they were on the air taking care of the radio station. And then I slid into a graduate program in EE at Duke, and they paid me money to be a teaching assistant. And back then, the rent on the place that I lived in was like maybe $150 a month. It didn't take much to live down here then.
And you were working in radio as an engineer, contract engineer during that time?
Well, let's see. I'm thinking now. Mostly, yeah. Actually, in terms of professional work in Durham, I started at WTIK, which is the AM country station in town, and was hired there to do much of what I'd done at the station in Connecticut, and to a certain degree what I did at one of the stations that I worked at, in addition to working at WHAT, which I did in 65 and 66 and 68. I worked at WIP in Philadelphia in 67 and 69 and 70.
And what was the Connecticut station?
The Connecticut station was WSOR. And WIP was one of the big gun stations. It was Metro Media property in Philadelphia. And the main thing that I did there was to do board operation. And that is where the talent is on one side of the glass with a microphone, and the engineer is running the levels and running the commercials and doing all that sort of stuff. And so I did that. And this gave me a different perspective on radio as opposed to WHAT, where there was a DJ and he ran the board and he talked on the air and he put the commercials in and kept the log. At WIP, the talent was the talent, and they were supposed to be creative and talented, and we took care as the engineers of the details. And this gave me another perspective on how radio could be done. And it's important to realize, as you do, that back in the 40s and 50s and 60s and into the 70s, commercial radio was a license to mint money in the basement. It was just the cash cow of the entertainment industry. And so WIP gave me a real indoctrination by fire with regard to, you got to get those commercials on the air and you got to do it right, and it's got to be 100% right all the time or you're going to get called on the carpet. One of the things that was interesting, of course, was that WIP was a union station and the engineers were unionized. And at one point, the program director decided that he was going to give the summer relief engineers, who we were, kind of a pep talk. And the shop steward got very upset with them about that and said that in no circumstances should they do that, that if they had a problem with the performance of one of their union members, you go to the shop steward and you talk to them, and they will talk to the individual and straighten them out.
Has that ethic or that sense of solidarity stuck with you as you've continued on in radio?
Well, yeah. I was very, I had no problem with joining the union at WIP. Now, interestingly enough, from what I understand, WHAT had been a union station, and they kicked the union out.
How did they do so? How does that process look like?
I don't know, because I came there after that, and Bob Hoy, who was the engineer that I worked for, who was the contract engineer there, was someone who, my understanding was that they brought in to replace the contract, the union engineers, and there was some friction about the whole thing that I was only very tangentially aware of. I think that it had, happened a number of years before.
Yeah.
I can't recall, it was the folks at WIP and the union were well aware that I had worked at WHAT and knew Bob Hoy, and and nobody ever brought anything up about it.
But it was a turn to contractors as opposed to sort of a union shop within the station. Is that how it worked?
Well, where?
Well, I'm just thinking about, to break a union, you would kind of turn to contract labor that...
Right, and that's what Bob Hoy was. He was contract labor.
And yet there's a tension, right? Because Bob Hoy is a mentor of sorts, the person that kind of taught you the trade a little bit.
Right.
No comment on that. It's just interesting to think about how these things can work sometimes.
Yeah, the whole thing, it was, because the talent was also union.
Yeah.
And I believe that the news people were union. And it was a case of that the news people were allowed to write copy, and they were allowed to record copy. But when it came to taking something, my recollection was that we had to come in and push the record button on the cart machine before they could dub a cart. Now, I think that kind of went by the wayside at some point because people realized it was silly.
The functionality was...
functionality. So there was this division of that okay, there's the talent who's on the air and, actually playing the records. We controlled those levels. But we did the commercials, we did the commercial logs. We were responsible for making sure the commercials got on the air. And it was not a case of that if an engineer didn't show up, that talent could go in and do anything. It was. But we were all very friendly and professional about it.
Is that how it was at WTIK?
TIK was not union. TIK was purely, I was an employee of the company, and I came in and, did the meter readings, and after, I don't remember when it started, maybe about I don't know whether it was in the late 60s or the early 70s, I started doing DJing and, covering air shifts and playing country music.
And I want to ask you about that, but what I'm wondering is, first, and I can couch it in this question as well, you came south. You came to North Carolina from the Northeast.
Mm-hmm.
What was different about that change in place? And then, is there a relationship between? I assume, or I imagine, that there were less union shops in the South than there were in the Northeast. Maybe I'm mistaken. But what was the difference there?
Well, Philadelphia was a big city and a big market, and and unionized, and on the other hand, Durham is a comparatively small city, and I'm not aware that there was any. I'm not aware of any particular union activity for engineers or talent in North Carolina
right.
in the late 60s and into the 70s. I'm not sure that there's much of that today.
Right.
So the main thing that, coming down to Durham, my feeling when I came down to Durham to Duke was, here it is, the fall of 1967, and walking around Durham, I felt like I was in 1957.
Explain what that felt like.
Well, it just seemed very kind of backward. It's not like it is today. It was, and I was really kind of shocked to find that there was basically no public transport. Because when I was up in Connecticut, I was very used to taking the bus into Hartford and going out, like I was having orthodontic work done. And someone from the school would drive me out to the appointment in the afternoon. And then when I was done, I'd take a bus from where the orthodontist office was in the suburb of Hartford into Hartford, transfer, and get on a bus that would take me up to Windsor. And in Philadelphia, I would typically, when I was working at WIP, which was down in Center City, and parking was a problem if it was during the weekday, when I was working the afternoon shift, which was either 3 to 11 or 4 to midnight, I would drive my car to the train station, park at the train station, get on the train, take the train into Philadelphia, and then come back at night on the train. North Carolina public transport, there were the Duke buses, and there were some Durham buses, but the idea, there was no way that I could get a bus from the Duke campus to WTIK. There's no way.
Yeah, so transportation, public transportation, infrastructure. But in terms of the cultural life of the city, what was it like, and what did you like to do?
Well, I can't say that I went off campus very much for that sort of thing. I was heavily involved with my studies. I was heavily involved with the radio station. There was very obvious that WTIK was I won't say, typical redneck, but it was definitely a Southern culture of what people did.
Mm.
They drove pickup trucks and.
Yeah, who was their audience?
Yeah. Well, their audience was, basically the, working class folk of Durham.
And what was the social climate like at that time? 67, you said you came?
Well, you got to remember, 68 was when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And at the same time, the various African American employee groups at Duke were working to unionize, and we were, as a student body, very much in support of that, and absolutely appalled at what had happened with Martin Luther King, and we went on a kind of a strike, so to speak. It was a if you look it up, it was called the Vigil, and a bunch of us basically stopped going to class, and it was kind of like what's happening today, where we had an encampment out on the main quad, and we were out there for like 4 days.
Kind of a general strike on campus.
Yeah, and this was also in support of the two unions, Union 77, which was the housekeepers, and another union that was over in the hospital.
So your fellow graduate students and yourself, you protested in solidarity.
Well, this was while we were undergraduates. In fact, that happened my freshman year. 68 was my freshman year.
And I do want to ask about the radio station WAFR, and you can help me get the dates right for when the community, and I know that folks at Duke were also central. I know that there was a gentleman, I believe, who may have been a student at Duke, who, through an act of protest, and I may have this wrong, kind of, I think I had read there was a strike involved, or there was some sort of act of disobedience in order to kind of push for a black community radio station. And I'm misremembering, but maybe you can tell me how the origin of that station.
Well, from my perspective and my recollection, because I was heavily involved in 1971 with the purchase of 107.1, the FM frequency, from WSRC by Duke. And there was a concern by some in the African American community that this would be a reduction in the amount of available programming targeted to the African American community,
right,
because WSRC AM was a daytime only station, and WSRC FM, which simulcast to WSRC AM pretty much 100% of the time, would stay on the air after WSRC AM had signed off at sunset. So the idea was that there was going to be a decrease in the amount of available programming. And an individual by the name of Steve Roberts was who was a student at North Carolina Central, was kind of the spokesman for this constituency, so to speak. And this was at a time when the FCC paid a lot more attention to programming than they do now. At this point in time, if a radio station decided that there was going to change format, and a group of people said, "Oh, we don't like that," the FCC would basically say, "We do not get involved in programming other than issues of obscenity. Really, that's about it. The fairness doctrine is gone. If something is said as libel or so on, the courts take care of that. The FCC is not involved in programming." But back then, that was not the case. So WAFR came about primarily through the actions of an individual by the name of Robert Chapman. Are you familiar with that name?
I've heard that name.
Right. And and from my recollection, which is, you got to remember, and we were concerned because our application for the transfer of the station from WSRC to Duke was being held up by this whole process. Well, Bob's solution was, we just start a community radio station. And so at that time, there was a frequency available, and there was some grant money available, and Bob was a very accomplished wheeler dealer, and he was involved with the acquisition of the 107.1 frequency for Duke, and he did a lot of the work for the application and startup of WAFR. And I was involved with the technical part of WAFR. I installed their transmitter and connected up their antenna, and negotiated with the various vendors to buy the equipment. It was one of my first experiences with buying equipment, and it was okay. I've learned a lot in that process, but we got them on the air. I think it was in September of 1971, and they were on the air for I don't know exactly how many years. I was involved with getting the station on the air, and I was also involved with decommissioning the station when urban renewal and economic situations had them off the air in, I think it was 1976, when I was involved with decommissioning the radio station and getting the equipment taken out of the building, because the building was going to be cleared for urban renewal.
So they were physically clearing the space.
Yeah, clearing the space.
To decommission the station.
And at that point, the station was off the air. I was not that aware of exactly what the economic circumstances of the station were. We built the station. Me, a guy who was both a DJ and an engineer for WSRC by the name of Ray Evans. Ray was involved, and a fellow who was 1 year ahead of me at Duke by the name of Evans Wetmore. We basically built the station, and Evans continued as their engineer because I was busy with graduate work and WDBS FM, which was the 107.1.
So, just to clarify for my purposes, so Steve Roberts was a student at the time at NCCU?
He was a student. I think he graduated. He's basically graduated the same year that I did, and went to work at the Wright School. And frankly, he and I got along quite well. It was, he was very professional and about the way he approached it. While it was professionally adversarial, he and I had, we were both radio people, because he had also worked at WSRC on the air and doing various things for that station.
And is that at Duke?
No, WSRC was the 1410 AM that we bought the 107.1 from.
Okay.
And Ray Evans, who worked at WSRC, also did overnights and late night at WTIK playing country music. And the people loved him.
It's overlap. There's a lot of overlap.
Oh, yeah, a lot of overlap. The fact of the matter is, everybody in Durham radio pretty much knew each other, and there was a guy by the name of, I've forgotten his first name was Ken, and he worked over at WSSB, which was the top 40 1490 station, and I remember he got the job over there, and he was doing overnights, and so we all listened in for his first broadcast, and we heard him play the Green Tambourine, and then there was Dead Air, and then there was another song. He was afraid from what we could tell, he was afraid to crack the mic. It took him a little while to get to the point where he felt comfortable being on the air. So we all did,
Yeah.
The fellow who was a year behind me at Duke by the name of George Graham, who was also technically inclined but also heavily into programming, he also worked at WTIK.
But getting back to WAFR, what do you see as the significance of that station in terms of offering black listeners a voice, in terms of being something to the black community? What did you see? What did it mean to you that station existed for that short period?
Well, it was a foot in the door. It was important because I think it got people interested in that. Out of that, because the other thing that's interesting, it was one of the earliest NPR affiliates.
Because the public radio, it was only in 1966, right, that the Public Radio Act, or I'm blanking on the name of the legislation, gets passed, right?
I don't know. It was interesting. Have you read Carl Castle's autobiography?
Not yet.
You should, because it talks a lot about the early days of NPR. Because he came to NPR very early on when they were doing things that nobody dreamed of, like putting women on the air doing news.
Right.
Like, this is a radical concept, but it caught on. And WAFR was one of the earliest affiliates, certainly down here. I have seen a map of the stations in the early days of WNPR's network setup. And in Durham, there's WAFR. And I believe they ran All Things Considered as part of their affiliation, because I think one of the things was that being an NPR affiliate gave them access to funding.
Right. Okay, so take me back to what you're thinking as you're moving through graduate school, but you're also sort of moonlighting or working professionally in radio at the same time. Mm-hmm. Was there ever a moment where you were thinking of doing anything other than radio?
Oh, yeah. It was not my intention. I'll tell you, and first of all, it was very obvious to me that radio did not pay very well.
Okay.
And that the type of salaries that radio engineers got, was not commensurate with what I should reasonably expect as a graduate of Duke University with a bachelor's in electrical engineering and the various things that I had done, and then a master's in electrical engineering. And the funny story about it is that I started in grad school in the fall of '71 and took courses, to round out the courses that I'd already had, and acted as a teaching assistant and as a research assistant. And then in the late winter of '72, this was like sometime either late '71 or early '72. The director of graduate studies came to me and said, well, look, you've completed all your coursework. All you've got to do is write your thesis. And we're not going to support you anymore. You've got to go get a job. And he said, no, I've got just the thing for you. And so I went to work for the Institute for Parapsychology. Now, were you aware of that?
No.
Okay. You've heard of J.B. Ryan and extrasensory perception?
Mm-mm.
Okay. Well, J.B. Ryan came to Duke in the early 30s as a protege, and I'm trying to remember the guy's name. He was a famous psychologist. And Ryan was interested in the whole question of life after death. And this then got into the idea of extrasensory perception. And he did a series of experiments in the early 30s, that culminated in a monograph published in 1934 about extrasensory perception. Well, he continued at Duke until he retired at some point in the middle 60s or early 60s, and founded a nonprofit called the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man, with one of the the main institute under it was the Institute for Parapsychology, that studied extrasensory perception and psychokinesis and telepathy and all these sort of topics. Well, and I believe that the director of graduate studies, I believe his name was John Artley. I'm sure about the Artley. He said, "I've just got the job for you because the Institute for Parapsychology is buying a computer and they need someone to run it."
So the electronics skill set came into use.
Right, and the computer skills, because, back in the 60s and 70s, I learned several programming languages, and a lot of what I took as graduate courses were computer-oriented courses. So I was hired to set up, basically it came in boxes, and I racked it up and put it together and got it working, and was their chief cook and bottle washer for all things computer and electronics from 1972 to 1980.
Well, what I'm curious about is, in doing that line of work around the Institute of Parapsychology, did it shape your radio work in any way? Did you think about people, audiences, human beings in a different way because of that work?
Well, not really.
I'm sure you got better as an engineer and as better as a computer technician.
But and also I picked up a fair amount of additional scientific background, because that involves statistics and design of experiments, and I was co-author on a number of papers, and and was involved in the actual work, and in 1974 it was brought to my attention by a coworker that he thought that the director, who was a protege of Dr. Ryan's, was faking results. And this resulted in what was called the Levy Affair in 1974. The director left, and Dr. Ryan, J.B. Ryan, who'd been basically kind of the director emeritus and was kind of trying to back out, needed to kind of reassert himself. And so we had some significant staff changes, and I continued there, working with them until 1980, when I started doing some contract work for a fellow over at Duke Hospital who was involved with the medical center, who was involved with echocardiography. And basically I was providing some programming and technical services on microprocessors for him. And so I did contract work for Duke. This was in like the late 1979 and into 1980. And then...
Did you like that work?
Oh yeah, it was fascinating. I'm not a radio deadhead who's only interested in radio. I was interested in computer science and everything else. I was very interested in parapsychology. I got very interested in cardiac physiology, because what happened was there was a senior resident who was in the Department of Surgery, who was tasked with setting up a lab and running a lab for the chairman of the department. And his name was Scott Rankin. Well, Scott went to, I'm trying to remember his name and it slipped my mind, the fellow that I was doing contract work for, and said, well, where can I find a bright PhD to help me with my lab? And this guy said, nah, you don't want a fresh PhD. You want someone who knows what they're doing, who's got some real experience. I've got just the guy for you. And that's how I got hired at the Department of Surgery as a research associate in the Department of Surgery. And
which hospital is this again?
Duke. At Duke Medical Center in the Department of Surgery at Duke. This was cardiac physiology research, primarily using animals. And our mandate and what our focus was characterizing the heart as a pump. Pressures and volumes and all that sort of stuff. I was involved with refining the development on an instrument called a pulse transit sonomicrometer, which measures heart dimensions by using ultrasound from two transducers that are placed on the outside of the heart. And I didn't invent it. I didn't build the first of them, but I built an awful lot of good ones. And we marketed them and sold them out of Duke and also out of my own business.
It's fascinating. Yeah.
So, and that continued until, and I did that, I started that in 1980 and retired from Duke in 2002.
Okay, so in that span,
That's a full-time job.
Your full-time job.
It's a full-time job.
But you're still doing some radio as well as you're going along.
Let's see. From 71 to 74, I was involved with the 107.1 at Duke.
Is that WDBS?
Yeah, WDBS. 75, from I think about 73 until like 75, I worked for WSRC as an engineer. And in 75, I was not involved with the Duke station until in the fall of 75, they said that they needed contract engineering work. So I went to start doing contract engineering work for WDBS in 75. Picked up WDUR, which was the successor to WSSB, as a client in 1976. Incorporated in 1982. Picked up WSRC as a client in 1983. And from there it just kind of snowballed. And so all the time that I was working at Duke, I was also doing contract engineering for radio stations.
I know at some point during that span you had a show called Sunday Night Special.
Mm-hmm.
What was the format like for that? What did you love to play? And how was it received? And who was your listeners?
Okay. Well, I got fired from WTIK for playing rock and roll because it's a country station. And the general manager at WTIK, a guy by the name of Buddy Poole, who I actually, he contacted me about a year or so ago, said, "Hey," and I said, "Hey, buddy." He was the station manager, and there was a program on WBT down in Charlotte called the Hall of Fame, and he said, "I want you to do something like that." So in 73, I've forgotten exactly when, I started doing it. And what I was doing was I was kind of presenting it as, well, modern country music to a certain degree has its roots in rock and roll. And so I'd be playing, oldies, 50s and 60s oldies interspersed with country tunes that had a real rock flavor to them. And he called me up and said, "Nah, just drop that country stuff. Just play the oldies." So from 73 until 74, I did the Hall of Fame on WTIK. Then Buddy Poole apparently applied for a job at another station someplace, and it got back to the owners of WTIK, so they canned him. And the owners came up and said, "Well, what's this guy playing rock and roll on Saturday nights?" And so after some back and forth, I was canned.
Okay.
So from 74 until 76, I was not on the air any place, which is fine with me because I was busy, working at the Institute for Parapsychology. And in 1976, a guy by the name of Joe Knuckles, who was the program director of WDNC, approached me. And he'd heard about the show, and I had an air check, and he liked it. He said, "Okay, you're doing Saturday nights from 7 to midnight." And so in December of 76, I started spinning oldies, and did on Saturday nights and Sunday nights. I think I started on Sundays and moved to Saturdays, and did that from 76 to 82. And basically what happened in 82 was they change the studio that I worked out of, and I really didn't like the new studio. And I said, "Nah, I've had enough of this." You know, it wasn't like, because I was busy. I was busy at Duke, and I had radio clients, and I was doing. I was DJing at the Bananas Lounge, doing beach music on Tuesday nights, and I had my hands full, so I had enough. So, and so there was a hiatus from 1982 until 1996 when I was not on the radio.
Well, you weren't on the air, but in this book allows
I was doing engineering. Oh yeah,
you were doing engineering. So bringing us to actually part of the purpose of this conversation to talk about WNCU,
right,
and 90.7 Jazz here in Durham. Tell me what you recall about the origins of that station and what your role was there as an engineer early on.
Right. Well, it was an interesting thing because I started at back at the Duke student station WXDU in 1986, and one of the things that I did was I got them a translator on 90.7. And so I became aware of the fact that North Carolina Central had done a construction permit application for 90.7 in 1990. So this was a matter of interest to me. But I also saw it as an opportunity, so I made some initial contacts and said, well, if you need some help. So I really didn't hear much of it until 1992 when Donald Baker contacted me. Because Donald had done a jazz show on WDBS back when it was back in the early days, and called Maiden Voyage as Shanga Siddiqui.
Is that when you met him?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we knew each other, and he knew that I was a halfway decent engineer, and that they needed some help specifying equipment and all that sort of stuff. And interestingly enough, Rashad Muhammad, does that name?
I've interviewed him.
Right. Well, anyway, he was involved in in some of that early stuff in 1992. But because I was also the engineer for Shaw for years.
I did not know that.
Oh yeah, I did their engineering up until the time that they were sold to EMF.
Okay, so and what year did you start engineering with Shaw?
Gosh, 97.
Okay.
Well,
that would be a whole other set of questions to ask, but we'll keep it focused for now on WNCU.
Yeah, some people joke that, there are lots of people who have worked at lots of radio stations around the market, but Jim Davis has not only worked for almost all of them, but he did it all at the same time.
Right, and helped play a formative role. So getting back, so you were in touch with Donald Baker. Donald Baker was looking for an engineer.
Right, and we basically were, specifying equipment and so on and so forth, and then things got held up because there was a competing application filed for the 90.7 frequency, and that held it up at the commission for an ungodly period of time.
And who was filing that?
It was a group out of Georgia. It was, it was this. I don't know a whole lot about them, but they were a group that basically got people to file applications on existing cross applications that, from what we could tell, it was a way of kind of extorting money out of them. Say, well, we're going to file against you and do this and that, and if you want us to go away, pay us X dollars.
Wow.
That was the impression that I got as to what happened. And you could talk to Donald. Certainly has a lot more detail about that than I did, because I was kind of, well, what's going on? Well, we got this people cross-filing, and also we had a lot of work to do, getting the tower site and getting the funding for the tower and the contractor to build the tower and just all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, what else goes into the forming of a station?
Well, you got to file the application. you got to do the engineering study, file the application. We knew that we needed to have a directional antenna because we were co-channel with WFAE in Charlotte on 90.7, and we were adjacent channel to the 90.5 station that was also one that I was involved with. That I think it was licensed to Wilson, but was located in Nightdale or somewhere. But anyway. So there was that, and then there was, figuring out the equipment, and there was finding a tower site and negotiating, use of the tower site, and then there was, because the site was owned by a guy by the name of, it was owned by Piedmont Communications, and because Piedmont Communications had bought the site from the owners of 107.1, when Don Curtis sold the 107.1 property to Pinnacle Broadcasting, he did not include the original, the second 107.1 site, because 107.1 started out at the 700 East Club Boulevard site on East Club Boulevard in Durham, which was also the AM tower. Then, when Duke bought it, we operated it from there for about, maybe 12 months or so, and then started building the tower on Rosa Sharon Road. So 107.1 operated from Rosa Sharon Road from 1972 until 1986. In 1986, after Don Curtis and Great American Media bought 107.1, they then arranged for the site out behind Oak Grove School, where it is now. And so we were broadcasting from the Oak Grove School site, but we still owned the site on Rosa Sharon Road, which could, serve as a backup site. Like, there's transmitter, antenna, and tower and everything there. Well, Don Curtis sold the 107.1, the Foxy 107, to Pinnacle Broadcasting. But what was not included was the Rosa Sharon Road site. And I was talking with the new ownership, Phil Morella, the new owner, and I said, well, we need to figure out what we're going to do about, the transmitter and so on that's out at Rosa Sharon. And he said, what? Because he didn't know that it even existed. So Don Curtis kept that tower. And, he had various clients and tenants on it. And then he sold it, as far as I recollect, to Piedmont Communications. So Piedmont Communications owned the site. Well, what they ended up doing was they took down the 330-foot tower that was there, which was a perfectly adequate tower for an FM radio station, but was not adequate for what Piedmont wanted to do in terms of two-way and so on and so forth. So the current tower got built in 1994, and the building got built in 94, and the transmitter went in 94, but we didn't have a studio. And so were the negotiations for the studio. We started building the studio in 95. I think as part of the licensing application, we actually broadcast from the transmitter site. And the first voice heard on 90.7 from the transmitter site was Steve Roberts.
Oh, wow. Full circle.
I had him come over. And we played, he did the idea, and then we played Come and Get These Memories by Martha the Vandellas.
Wow.
At the transmitter site, and they shut everything down.
Did I read somewhere that some of the equipment used within the studio was actually old AFR equipment? Or am I mistaken on that? Do you recall that at all? Do you know where the equipment came from to start?
We bought it.
You bought new equipment?
Bought new equipment,
okay.
New transmitter, because the fact of the matter is the bulk of the AFR studio equipment disappeared. The transmitter was there, the antenna was there, the transmission line was there, There were a few odds and ends, and there were like 3 cart machines that I had carried to my shop to do evaluations on, because there was no power. There was nothing there at the studio. Everything was a mess. And so they were there, and that was it. In terms of equipment from AFR, all the rest of it, I don't know what happened to it.
Was it a jazz format from the very beginning at WNCU?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But we built the studio. I got the contract to build the studio. We started in June of '95, and we had it completed in about a month and a half. We managed to get it done because they had done all of the construction work, and they put in all the conduits that I needed and so on. So everything was ready for me to go in, and the racks were there, and we, and the thing is, a radio station in 1995 was a lot simpler than a radio station today.
How so?
Well, there's no HD, there's no streaming. You've got a board, you've got a couple of turntables, you got a couple of cart machines, you got a microphone, and that feeds a processor. That then fed over through copper pairs to the roof of Baines Dormitory. We had a processor, an STL transmitter. That went out to the transmitter. The only thing that was at all fancy was we did have initially satellite equipment because we were an NPR affiliate. So we had satellite receivers, and we carried NPR programming. But it was very simple, If it's all gone now because of the renovation, but it was 2 Bud racks with equipment, and that was it. And then there was a whole bunch of wires. Like we spent most of our time, pulling and punching down and connecting wires and getting all the equipment talking to each other. But I had built radio stations before. I built WAUG at St. Augustine's College in 1986. So
okay, You've got significant experience as an engineer at HBCU campuses. I want to know what it means to you to do this kind of work for or at stations located on HBCU campuses. What's special about doing radio on an HBCU campus in your view?
Well, having spent my formative years, you really get your sense of where you are in the world, in your teen years, really. And working at WHAT and working with all the African American people there and being immersed in the music and the culture, and doing remotes from the Uptown Theater, which was like the Apollo in New York is the Uptown in Philly, and the Regal down in Baltimore. I think it was the Regal. Doing that sort of stuff, it was something that, it made sense to me, AUG, the guy over there is Jay Holloway, who was involved with Corporation for Public Broadcasting at UNC for a while. He's this great guy, a charismatic leader, and Donald Baker was a charismatic leader, and Emeka Amakawa over at Shaw, charismatic leaders. They get you excited about what you're doing.
And what about the sort of, both in terms of service to students and the communities that are generated around these HBCU campuses? Do you get a sense, even as an engineer, of how significant that connection is to their listenership and to the people on these campuses?
I like to think so. The interesting thing about it is, WSHA's slogan was serving the community like no other, which really hit home. AUG always struggled because it was a commercial station that was set up as a nonprofit. So they could raise money by selling commercials, but it was a nonprofit radio station.
Interesting. I didn't realize that.
That was what they were. Primarily because of being an AM and having a limited signal range, and being a daytimer. They were kind of a unique puppy. But I enjoyed working there. The main problem with AUG was getting paid.
Sure.
And that was always, that was also, that was issues at all of the HBCUs was, getting paid.
Money and resources.
And, I didn't take it personally. I would just kind of let them slide and hopefully they'd get caught up. And I have one client now who's Hispanic, owns a bunch of radio stations. He owes me 5 figures. But he sends me a check every once in a while, and, the balance isn't getting any bigger. And people say, well, why do you put up with it? And I say, well, okay, I've been working with the guy for 20 years, and I billed him hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I've gotten 90% of it. We need to get back on track.
No, it's okay. Well, you're raising some interesting questions around the resourcing of radio stations, especially at HBCUs and community and ethnic stations that, there's some struggle there. And, it's not an easy landscape to navigate or to manage. Can you tell me a little bit about, you did spend a little bit of time on air at WNCU, and I believe you still host a program. Can you tell me about that programming?
So we got the station on the air, and it's funny. It's a funny story. The administration at NCCU, and Donald will tell you this, we had the station ready to go, and they said, okay, do it. So we programmed it for a day, and then they said, okay, pull the plug. And it wasn't until a week later that we actually started broadcasting full-time, 7 days a week.
And what did that initial program look like?
Oh, well, it was, jazz. It was jazz programming and NPR, and, we were ready and we did it. And, it's a funny thing, it's hard getting a station going from scratch and programming from scratch. I can tell you by example, WCHL down in Chapel Hill, where I'm still working and have worked for years, we did a complete shift of facilities and essentially a format when we put the station back on the air in November of 2002. And we had it all set up, and it's just very, very ambitious programming goals. And we ran the station for like 3 days, and the station manager ended up in the hospital because of collapse. And we basically went to programming Christmas music for about a week while everybody recovered and got things back together.
How many stations are you juggling at a time typically as an engineer?
I don't know. I don't keep count anymore.
It's that many.
Yeah. Well, it's also a matter of, you got translators. Like one of my clients is Radio Training Network, which is a religious broadcaster. It's kind of like EMF, only these people, from my feeling, do it right. They have stations, they have studios, they have personnel, and you can walk into their studio and there's somebody there. There's a receptionist and a general manager and programming people. That's not the way EMF works. They got their central thing and everything's satellite. But anyway, Radio Training Network in the Raleigh-Durham area owns a full power FM 88.5 and a full power 90.1. And they lease HD2 on 100.7, the iHeart station. I've forgotten what, WRVA or something. And they have fill-in translators off of the HD2. And they probably got 10. And we're primarily responsible for keeping them all on the air.
Forgive my ignorance. Define what a translator is.
Okay, a translator is rebroadcasting the signal, the programming of a primary station. So, for instance, WRTP 88.5 would have a translator, say 20 miles away, that then picks up their signal and rebroadcasts it on a different frequency. Now, then there's the concept of fill-in translators. And the idea of a fill-in translator is you have a translator that is within the coverage of your primary station, but for one reason or another can't really be heard very well. The primary can't be heard very well. So you drop in a fill-in translator that rebroadcasts that programming. Now, the wrinkle on this is that the primary can be an HD 2 or 3 channel. So, for instance, for Radio Training Network, they lease the 100.7 HD2 channel. And so anywhere within the coverage area of the 100.7 HD2, they can have a fill-in translator. Because if you listen on the FM band, you can't hear that HD2. But so they put a translator in that rebroadcasts that, and that's what they can hear.
I see.
And so they've got all these translators, and, well, is it 2 stations? Is it 12 stations? I don't know.
I see where you lose count.
Yeah, so I don't count them anymore.
Okay,
it's a lot.
we'll circle back to the programming question. Describe the show or shows you have hosted on WNCU and what the formats are.
Okay, the show is called 8-Track Flashback. And how it got that name was the program director of WNCU at the time basically kind of absconded with that name from VH1 that had some sort of thing called 8-Track Flashback. And so, he had this program on called 8-Track Flashback, and he had some guy who was playing music, and something happened. The guy couldn't make it or something, and Jerry Carter, who knew that I had done programming, had done oldies, said, "Oh, why don't you show me what you can do?" So I came in with a bunch of CDs, and it was very popular, and so I started doing it in November of 1996, and have been doing 4 hours on Saturdays for the most part every Saturday since November 1996 to date.
And how would you describe your listenership, and how do you engage with your listeners?
Well, it's basically, it's African American R&B, but I mix in a certain amount of rock and roll, a certain amount of jazz. Like I'll play Horace Silver's Song from My Father. I will play Take 5 by Dave Brubeck. I play Windy by Wes Montgomery. I play Soulful Strut by the Young Hold Unlimited. But I play a lot of Chuck Berry, a lot of Fats Domino. But I also play some Elvis. I also play Roy Orbison.
And your listeners, do you have a sense of who your audience is?
Well, you'd have to ask Mark Muller. Mark Muller can tell you that. It's a well-rated show.
And
pardon me, I have to stand up.
Okay.
Oh, I can't sit for too long.
No worries.
But we could probably continue.
And is there any engagement with listeners? Any calling in or anything like that, or is it all?
Oh, from time to time people call in. It's a funny thing. At one point, I said, well, I want to take some requests, and you people call in and tell me what you'd like to play. Me to play, and a guy called in and said, "I don't know what I want you to play. I want you to tell me what I want to listen to because you do such a good job of it."
Okay.
Because, the thing is, a lot of people, I think, who listen to the show don't necessarily know a lot about the genre. They just know that they enjoy it. And so, and I dig back, I play a lot of stuff. I play stuff from the 40s. I play stuff from the early 50s. In fact, I've got more early 50s stuff than I've got late 60s stuff.
Do you ever engage with students learning the work of radio? Like, do you ever take on students to be a part of the program that you host, or your engineering work in any way?
I've not.
No students have ever knocked on your door and said, "Mr. Davis, I'm interested in what you're doing."
I can't say that I ever have. That's the thing. You see, radio is not the sexy thing it was 40 years ago. Radio in the 60s and 70s, people were beating down your door to get involved with it. Now, not so much.
That's a good way for me to ask you, how has radio changed over the time of your career? How else has it changed besides that?
Well, there are a couple of things. First of all, there's so much consolidation as a result of the 1996 Broadcast Act that commercial radio is, it's not surprising that they're losing audience, because it's not just that they have competition. It's just, to a great degree, it's that their product isn't nearly as good as it used to be. And I see commercial broadcasters doing dumb things, like you have someone who's a talent who is well enough known in the market that NPR that UNC interviews them, and they get let go. And so much of programming is now satellite syndicated delivery, and it's hard for me to hear that there's local involvement with that. And some of the more interesting people kind of disappeared. I don't think that there's anybody who's really replacing Larry King anymore. There's nobody like that. There was a fellow who was on, who was syndicated, and was on, one of the Radio 1 stations that I, work for, called Michael Baisden. And he was very interesting and very engaging. And then all of a sudden he was gone because he got into some sort of salary dispute, or some sort of, that someone said, well, we overpaid you, and so you owe us $1 million. And the Michael Baisden story would be very interesting. He's an author as well as a radio person, and we did a remote broadcast. I got a chance to meet him, and he was really a fascinating person. You meet so many fascinating people in radio, but they come and go.
Totally. Sounds like any industry in the recent times, precarious, and there's less stability for a career.
Well, there's some people like Tom Joyner, like he was around for ages and very talented and very good, and he just reached the point where, like some of us, we're just aging out.
I'll move us towards the end here. I'm interested in your perspective. You're a white male. What does it mean to step onto this HBCU campus and to be a part of this community? What does it feel like to work at this station? And you can speak to other HBCU stations as well.
Well, NCU has always been, it's, for the most part, always been a very positive experience for me. There are very few people that I've ever run into that I've had any particularly negative relationships with, And the thing is that there are a surprising amount of white folk involved with the radio station and involved with the campus. The project managers that are involved with the renovation, is a mixed bag of African Americans and Caucasians. We've got a white program director here. We had a white program director, Betsy Calloway. We've had a white operations manager who UNC stole from us. Steve Taxman, who is a volunteer who does the show before me, is Caucasian. He's a doctor over at Duke who's just fascinated with jazz and knows everything about it, and is glad to give his time. We had various white folk that have volunteered for the station.
Yeah.
There were a fair number of white folk in and out over at Shaw.
Is radio an equalizing medium?
I think it is. I think it is because the fact of the matter is, these days, radio tries to establish a level of professionalism, and frankly, professionalism is the absolute opposite of having racial tensions, because being professional is just something that is important for everybody. And being professional in your interactions with people. You may not agree with everybody, but you can treat them with respect. And if you do that, you can manage to bridge most any sort of difference that you have, even if it comes down to, well, I disagree with you, but I respect you, and we can just agree to disagree.
I like that idea, that something about radio that helps promote dignity or respect for one another and people, maybe. I do want to kind of turn the lens on us momentarily, the HBCU Radio Preservation Project. What do you think it is that's important about this work that we're doing with this project to preserve the history of HBCU radio? Why is it needed?
Well, I think it's important because the history of radio is really neglected, and it's sad because there's so many people who were involved in so many aspects of it that are likely to be forgotten, and luckily there are people who are interested in that. And in fact, an employee of my contracting company by the name of Robbie Delius is also an archivist and has been instrumental in preserving a lot of stuff, basically going over to the libraries and getting copies of old, and organizing it and having it so that, and over at WDNC, where I still work, and where I did the oldies show from 76 to 82, and then did engineering for them from like 82 until 88, their transmitter site had all sorts of memorabilia that he ended up preserving and passing on to Curtis Media when they owned it. Curtis Media probably has a really good collection of memorabilia from PTF and some of the other radio stations. But it's so easy for a radio station to just clean stuff out. It's just WTIK. I was absolutely horrified when I went over there to do some work for the current ownership, and not only had they cleaned out all of the history stuff, but they'd even thrown out all the spare parts for the transmitter. They didn't know what it was, and so they just threw it out. And down at WGTM in Wilson, where it was owned by, you're probably familiar with the name Bishop Willis. Oh, you don't know about Bishop Willis?
Nope.
Well, Bishop Willis, very checkered history, based out of Norfolk, Virginia, owned a bunch of radio stations and absolutely got busted by the FCC to the point where he owned WSRC for a while. WSRC, I don't know who originally owned it, but then it got bought by a group of either doctors or dentists who ran it until they tried to sell it to a fellow in 1985. That fell through, and Bishop Willis bought it. And Bishop Willis ran it until the FCC basically busted him for everything in the world, and he was forced to sell the station to Davidson Broadcasting. So anyway, so Bishop Willis owned WGTM, which was it was daytime covered 30 counties down east, and nighttime covered 9 counties with an AM signal. And so they had a transmitter site with more stuff in it than you could shake a stick at, and a studio that was likewise. And when the owner of it, Celestine Willis, basically had to give up the station, the FCC, I'm trying to think what the term is. They red lighted it, that she could not renew the license, and so the net result was she lost the license because it expired and could not be renewed. And there's all sorts of stuff there, and all got stolen. Everything got stolen. I don't know who came in, but for years, people were stealing copper from the antenna system. And I would go and patch it back together and get them operating with, one tower, and, use a spit and baling wire to keep them on the air. And then finally they lost their license, and the FCC basically told her, do not turn on that transmitter. And then, after we basically had nothing more to do because they had no license, some people showed up in the middle of the night, and cleaned out the building completely, transmitters, everything, and everything gone.
Yeah. What?
And Celestine Willis, who owned the station, I will work for and with African American station owners just to help them out. And Celestine probably owes me $1,000, but she's got these towers. You see, the towers are still there in Wilson, the 4 towers, and they represent an aeronautical hazard. So the way you deal with that is you put notice to airmen out to notify the FAA that the towers are there, and that air people, pilots need to know that they're there and they're not lit. And so every month I renew the notice. I don't charge her. Every once in a while she sends me a check or so, against her balance, and that's nice. Thank you, Celestine. And I try and help people out, and I expect that they'll pay me at some point.
That's a good lead-in for me to ask you one of these final questions here. How do you want to be remembered? What do you want your legacy to be as a radio person?
Well, as a really good engineer who was a really dyed-in-the-wool radio person, that radio was a big part of his life. It wasn't his whole life, because I worked for the Institute for Parapsychology. I had 22 years at Duke, got a PhD in biomedical engineering. And then when I retired from Duke, I went to work for Radio 1 as their engineer for their Raleigh cluster, Foxy 107, 104, 103.9 The Light, the gospel station, and K97.5, and was their chief engineer from 2002 until I retired in 2015.
What's the big difference between working in commercial versus non-commercial to you?
Well, there's baggage involved with each of them, but it's different baggage. At Radio 1, I'm constantly dealing with budgets and acquisition, and dealing with the fact that we got to really keep very careful about making sure that all the commercials air within the proper day parts, and the fact that the staffs at commercial stations are just getting cut to the bone, which means, and it's sad because these are people that I really like. One of the reasons that I continue to work to this day for Radio 1, even having retired officially and there's a funny story there, having retired as the full-time chief in 2015, is because I really like the people there, and the people there really like me.
Yeah. It's a people business.
It's the people that make it work. And if I don't like the people, I'm not going to work for the station.
That makes sense. And we've focused on your professional life and your time in radio, but I'd like to give you a moment to speak to your personal life, if you're, to the extent that you're willing. And did you get married? Do you have kids?
Yeah, I got married. I got married once, and I got married a second time. And luckily, my second wife, her father was in media. He was a sales manager for WFMY TV in Greensboro for years. And right about the time that I met her and we got married, he bought an AM/FM combo in Kinston, WFTC and WRNS, and ran it for a while until he decided that it isn't working for me. And then he went in 1985 and was the general manager for WDNC G105 from 85 until I think it was about maybe around 87, when he basically said, I'm sick and tired of feeling sick and tired. Someone else can do this. But the thing was that my wife Nancy understands radio. She does not have a problem with the fact that I might have to get up and run out someplace at 2 o'clock in the morning to fix something. And in fact, she works in the business. She every day she has a series of transmitter sites that she calls and writes down and makes sure that the parameters are all right, and says, hey Jim, the temperature's too high at WSRP. Say, well, but he doesn't have any air conditioning, he's not going to buy any, it's a transmitter on the air. Yep. So
you're sparking a new question now. What's the greatest ecological disaster or hazard that you've had to address as an engineer in your career?
Floods.
Any specific floods stand out?
Oh, God. Well, let me see. Well, we had Hurricane Fran, which was in either 95 or 96, that took down the WXTU tower. And we had to operate at 10 watts for years because it took us a while to get them rebuilt. Flood in 2000 in Wilson for WLLY, that, the transmitter is about yay high. It was like this high, and over the top of it are meters, and the water's got up to the meters. So, wow. They called me and said, well, the station got completely flooded. And I came down and there was just nothing salvageable in the building. So what we did was, one of the owners was a horse type person over in Graham. And so he drove over with a horse trailer. And we threw together a studio and a horse trailer. And I used a 25-watt transmitter that I built when I was an undergraduate at Duke, and ran a cable out to the tower and got them back on the air at 25 watts. And the funny thing was, after we got them up and running, the guy from Graham drove down to see what was going on. He comes in and he says, well, sounds pretty good on 25 watts. What do we need the other 975 watts for? And I said, well, the FCC wants us to do it. And it will give you better coverage and better sound. So, a flood where completely everything was destroyed, and we had the station back on the air in about a week. It took us about a week to get it back on. Then we had a flood in Kinston that just completely destroyed the studio building to the point where we could not use it again. And we discovered that before we bought the station, this had happened before. No, we really didn't realize how bad it was. So anyway, they got flooded, and we got them back on the air and ended up moving a transmitter from one of this client's other stations down there and got him in and got him back to reasonable power. And then 2 years later, they got flooded out again in another hurricane. So those are ecological disasters.
Yeah. Any fires?
No fires. I've not had a fire. Floods, hurricanes, towers down. I remember when I was working at TIK, I wasn't there when it happened, but I was working at the station at the time, coming in, on weekends, and suddenly the operator at the station one evening gets a call, hey buddy, one of your towers is in my backyard. And one of the 3 towers of the station had been cut down and because of the design of the directional antenna, there wasn't a lot of power in that tower, so it didn't knock the station off the air. But so, wow. And we had at one point we had some folks try and saw through a guy wire at WDBS when it was out on Rosa Sharon Road. We were able to go out and identify that there were marks in the guy wire where someone had cut it. And one point in the DBS days, I'm thinking whether it was DBS or whether it was NCU, someone climbed up the tower and put a Confederate flag on the top.
Wow. And what'd you do?
We
What'd you guys have
got
to
a
do?
tower,
it down?
tower climber came, and we had him take it down.
Wow. That's bold.
Yeah.
Okay.
And of course, they climbed right through the aperture of the antenna, which, is not a good thing.
No.
It probably didn't hurt them that much, but might have made them feel a little warm.
The links people will go to.
Oh, well, and we'd have people climb the WCHL towers down in Chapel Hill. They're hot, but if you jump on it, and grab hold, then you're okay.
Okay, well, I've taken up too much of your time, but I do want to ask, is there anything regarding your life that you feel has been left out of this conversation that you want to get on record before we close? Or any people you want to shout out, maybe mentors or folks who helped you along the way?
Well, Bob Hoy, who I've mentioned, who was, great guy. Unfortunately, I went to check on him, a number of years ago and discovered that he died of diabetes at the age of like 52. Del Dengate, who was the chief engineer for WIP, who, is an interesting thing. A fellow by the name of Tom Bush, who he and I were, best buds back in our teenage years. He was about 2 years older than I was. And Tom Gallagher, who, I got them both interested in radio, and they got their first-class radio telephone licenses. And Tom Gallagher went to work at WIP before I did, and it was, Tom who told Del Dengate, well, I know this guy that you need to hire this coming summer because he's really good. And so, Tom got me involved with WIP. And Tom Bush, who I got interested in, went to Boston College, which is, is Catholic University. And he got involved with the Jesuits and moved up to Alaska and was the first engineer for KNOM in Nome, Alaska, which was run by the Jesuits. And so I was very fortunate that when I got involved with Radio 1, one of the things that we used to do at Radio 1, which we don't do anymore, unfortunately, is to go to the NAB convention. And so I got in touch with Tom Bush, who was up in Alaska, and he said, well, I'm coming to the NAB. And so after, I think the last time that I laid eyes on Tom was in the early 70s. And in 2003, we met up at the NAB convention.
Oh, cool.
And then I think it was 2005, we got together again at the radio convention in Philadelphia, which was neat for both of us because we were from Philadelphia. And one of the things we did was we went down and had lunch at the Reading Market, the Reading Terminal, which is just a fixture of downtown Philadelphia. And unfortunately, he passed of diabetes in 2010, and I didn't even know that he'd passed until I, was reading something about it. So
thank you for saying their names.
Yeah. So, and here, Bob Chapman for all the things that he did with WDBS and a whole lot of people. I mentioned George Graham, who's heavily involved with station in central Pennsylvania, in Scranton, Wilkes-Barre area, an NPR station that he was instrumental in getting on the air. I'm sure someone else will come to mind after we stop. But.
No worries. Well, Jim, it's been a real honor to hear your story and for participating in this project. We really appreciate it. And I wish you well as you continue on as a very active engineer across North Carolina.
Well, just trying to keep it on the road. As you get older, you start having health concerns and things that limit you, and you just kind of try and work through them and work around them.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.